if you have a human being who's in a war, regardless of era, this is what they're going to have to worry about. This is what's going to be on their mind. These are the problems they're likely to have. And, culture and technology will change that somewhat, but the base problem is, generally the same.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Timons Esaias about warfare for writers, including how military history can serve as an invaluable resource for authors crafting stories that involve conflict, whether they are set in fantasy, science fiction, or historical periods. Esaias provides insights and guidance on how to incorporate elements of military history and strategy into fiction in a way that's engaging and informative. And now let's hear from Timons Esaias about warfare for writers. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Timons Esaias. Hey, Timons, how are you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Timons Esaias is a satirist, writer, and poet living in Pittsburgh. His works, ranging from literary to genre, have been published in 22 languages. He has been a finalist for the British Science Fiction Award and has won the Winter Anthology Contest, the SFPA Poetry Contest, and the Asimov's Readers Award twice. And he's a recent Pushcart nominee and Intrepid Award winner for the story To Do. And Timons has been a guest on the podcast back in episode 264, The Secrets of World Building. It's the Small Stuff with Timons Esaias. And so I'm trying to think back about how exactly this topic came up. But what normally happens is there's some generic topic that I'm interested in talking about someone with, and then we have the conversation. And then retrospectively, I usually go in and pick a title for it. But we already know the title. So the title of this episode is going to be Warfare for Writers. And I was so fascinated by this topic that I booked it without having any more information about it. But let's start out talking about what made you interested in the topic of warfare for writers, and what exactly are you talking about? Do you mean this figuratively, literally? Give us a little more background on that.
Well, I don't really want to send authors into battle personally, but I have been fascinated with military history from childhood. We went to battlefields. I lived here in Pennsylvania in the, grade school days. We went to Gettysburg. We went to Fort Pitt. We went up to Erie and saw the brig Niagara. We went to Boston and saw the Constitution. And, well, a triggering thing was that my father, after we had visited the Niagara and learned about the War of 1812, he took me to the Carnegie Library and got a book on the War of 1812 for me to read. What I did not know until years later was that it was Teddy Roosevelt's book on the War of 1812. And it would describe the battles in interesting detail, and then it gave the butcher's bill. And I just looked at that. It was appalling, because basically you're parking two houses next to each other with giant cannons sticking out the windows and firing away. Just appalling casualties. And I couldn't, the real question I had was, how can people make themselves do that? And that's been a question that's stuck with me. But it got me interested in naval military history, and I followed with other kinds. And I have a tendency to get reference books and primary sources in my library when I'm interested in something. And then years later, when I became a writer, well, I was the guy you would call to ask about military stuff that you needed, back in the days of phones and landlines. So some of you will be unfamiliar with this. I was the guy you'd call when you needed information. And over time, it became clear to me that I was not getting the kind of call so what color were the uniforms of the 79th Foot in 1811? Which is easily handled, and I could probably tell you. I would get questions like, what's an officer? What's a unit? And, I would answer the questions, and I began developing well-practiced answers to some of these questions. But I was always looking for the book that I should refer these folks to, the simple description of warfare for people who know nothing about it, but in technical enough detail so that they could turn it into fiction. There were a couple of titles that had been hinted to me as being the book. And then, one time I was working with a colleague on this, and I thought, I need to go find the book. There's no book. There are occasional warfare books for journalists for the war that's happening right now. It tends not to have much historical context. It's just, this is what's being used in Ukraine this week. This is what's to know about that, blah, blah, blah. But, the basic concepts, if you don't understand what warfare is and how it works, there's no book. And so eventually I decided I should write the book. And I should have written the book at least 8 years ago, but I'm getting paid to work on the project without having had to produce an actual book yet. I have all the pieces lying around. I give workshops, I give consultations, I lecture on it, et cetera, et cetera. Income comes in and, that makes it seem ridiculous to actually sit down and finish the thing. I need to finish it by the end of the year, to be frank.
So do you focus on things that are generalizable across eras, or do you specialize in a particular era of warfare?
I have made part of this is I taught at Seton Hill for 20 years. I was teaching people to write popular fiction novels, and they were writing fantasies that were set in a fake Middle Ages. They were doing historicals all the way back to the Roman Empire, science fiction with warfare in the future. And that just made me think, if I'm going to do this thing, it needs to be applicable to anybody. So, I will discuss, of course, one could do 60 volumes on this, but I will explain that there are certain things that are fundamental. And it's, Genghis Khan had to deal with the same thing they're dealing with in Ukraine, and he did it on the same ground. And trying to, tease those out. If you have a human being who's in a war, regardless of era, this is what they're going to have to worry about. This is what's going to be on their mind. These are the problems they're likely to have. And, culture and technology will change that somewhat, but the base problem is, generally the same. How are you going to feed them? How many weapons can they carry to the battle, and how quickly will they exhaust everything they brought and be standing there useless? So I'm doing it over the whole course of history.
So what are some of the basic things that you've encountered? You've already mentioned a couple of them. What are your answers to them? And then can you give an example of how you've helped students generalize that to things like science fiction or fantasy or some of the other genres that you mentioned?
Yeah, so let me start with a trick. I frequently explain that if you're wanting to think about warfare in your book, especially the folks with science fiction, there's clearly no historical documents for that. But I tell them, pick any war and read up on some basic things that went on in that war, and then figure out what would be the same and what would be different in the world you're imagining in the future. So, you can use the Napoleonic Wars as a pony for, galactic imperialism. And you're likely to be more comprehensible to the reader if you're working from a model that, might be knocking around in the back of their heads. The question of what a unit is comes up a lot. And I have a simple answer, which is that a unit is a machine made out of people. And the unit has a purpose, a goal, and the machinery is made up of people. The unit is meant to survive even when the individual people mostly don't. They are replaceable parts. And for a writer, the other thing to remember is that a unit, whichever level of unit it is, will have characteristics to the degree that it's essentially another fictional character, if you want to use it that way. I point them to the Band of Brothers television series. which educates you on how a unit, is born, how it grows, how it becomes unique, depending on its history and its training and who just happens to be in it. So that's the big revelation I'm usually giving to writers who haven't dealt with warfare, is that you need to know what the unit is trying to do, not just what your protagonist is trying to do. What unit is he in, or she? What is its purpose? And how is that going? And of course, for fiction, it needs to be going badly on the whole. And to me, it's sort of amazing that, Americans watch so many war movies and don't know what officers are for. But I explain that, they are the controller chip in the machine that is the unit, and that their fundamental purpose is to keep the unit focused on its task. They're the driver. Even if they're sending messages to the unit from a distance in the rear, they're still the driver. The unit is, in many periods of history, the unit's kind of a drone with somebody operating it from the back. But then you'll have your local officers, your junior officers, who are actually with the unit itself. But that one fundamental duty of an officer when in the field, and that is to know where the heck they are and where the heck the enemy is if they're around. In other words, they need to reconnoiter their position. And historically, there are always officers who don't bother. They find an excuse. They set up camp on the other side of the hill from the enemy, completely oblivious that they're there. They don't send out scouts, or they don't let them go very far, or whatever. And boy, is that an opportunity for drama. Historically, it's been the basis of some colossal disasters. And in your fiction, there's the thing. Which officers are doing their job? Which officers are not doing their job?
And Band of Brothers is a great example of that.
I was about to say.
Yeah.
We have the original unit captain who cannot read a map. And he keeps getting them in trouble in training because he cannot read a map. And, well, they get rid of him, and then they have people who can read maps, and, they're great.
And he not only couldn't read a map, but he was sort of the embodiment of every bad thing you wouldn't want, and the struggle that imposes on the characters, that there's the obvious struggle of they're going into battle, but they're also struggling internally against this force of the bad officer. It feels like there are layers of storytelling opportunity there.
Exactly. That's the thing. There are, in Band of Brothers, there are two specific officers who are a problem. There's the training officer, who actually trains them rather well, though he's a jerk about it.
Right.
And he read a map, right? But the unit starts to cohere around the non-com officers and junior officers who are having to make up for him. So, the unit figures out how to survive despite this guy. And that's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
That's what you want. And then later there's Dyke, who he's fearful and incompetent. And, once again, they have to bypass him. But there's a certain coherence among the unit when they finally realize that this guy's just going to get us killed. We have to, make sure he gets out of here somehow.
The memorable scene for me is when Winters runs into him later and the officer doesn't salute Winters, who now outranks him.
Oh, yes. Training officer. Yeah.
You salute the uniform, not the man.
Yep.
I thought that was a lovely storytelling wrap up. Might have been true too, but it was a lovely storytelling wrap up of that interaction.
It was true. And let's beat the Band of Brothers to death. Actually, I suggest that people watch that series, no matter what their working on, because the series itself was very carefully written. I think it's kind of brilliant because it trains the reader to understand the later scenes. So they take you through the training and bring up all the key concepts you need to understand. There's this brilliant scene where they're in training and they're practicing seizing a T intersection. And there's the guy on the bicycle who keeps running into them no matter which way he goes, which shows you how it works. And then, in Belgium, they're going to have to do that again. And, so you already have a sense of what has to be achieved.
Yep.
My favorite line of the whole thing is when they're getting ready to go into Bastogne, and the officer who's been trying to get ammunition to them says, gives them the size up of the situation that they're going to be surrounded by morning. And he apologizes. And Winters says, "Oh, that's no problem. We're airborne. We're meant to be surrounded." And that's actually the truth. They were the best unit to have there because airborne and airdroppable units have to train to be surrounded. That's what they are going to be from the minute they hit the ground. A lot of the dramatic effects that you want in writing about warfare, they're all in that series.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me think about when people are thinking of writing warfare, I think that, it would be easy to think of the actual battles as what you're building your whole storyline around. But I think Band of Brothers is a great example, or Saving Private Ryan. It's not really the battle that's the focus. It's the stories that are happening to each of the characters that are being impeded by the battle or helped by the battle or whatever the circumstances are. So, and those can all be considered in the category of warfare. How do you decide how you're going to balance the action scenes with the more character-focused scenes?
Well, one of the things that I point out to folks is that you can write great military fiction that has no battles in it. In fact, it's an advice I give to people who just really don't have an idea. I point to Marion Zimmer Bradley and the Mists of Avalon. She did not understand warfare. And here's this Arthurian Knights doorstop novel. It has no battles. It has no jousts. It has none of that. So she just wrote around it. We have the effects of war as it, comes back home, but we don't actually see it. And the one, she got one thing very right and one thing embarrassingly wrong, but only for a sentence. And so I used them both as examples of, so somebody explained to her how long a process it is to breed up the number of war horses you would need for a real campaign. She read or understood where in England you could grow war horses and how long it would take. And there's a wonderful section that talks about that. But she also has the Saxons were massing off the coast all summer. Well, Saxons couldn't mass off a coast to save their lives. There were enough Saxons, there weren't enough ships, and there's no reason to mass off the coast. That's a World War II thing. That's D-Day. And so I pulled that embarrassing sentence out and said, I want you not to do this. But if you don't know what's going on, you can avoid it. Or you can do what Patrick O'Brian does in the Aubrey Maturin series. He has battles, but they're very few, and he often skips them and then has somebody think back to what happened. I mean, it's clearly not the battles that are important. What he's focused on is the officers having to worry, and that's the job of an officer. He has to worry, and that allows you to tell the story of what's going on based on what he's worrying about.
Yeah. And
of course, one of the key things he's going to worry about is that he doesn't know half of what's going on. And, inexperienced writers tend to have all of their soldiers know what's happening. And it's not like that at all. Soldiers, even the junior officers, rarely have any idea what's going on. And, much of what is happening in any battle is unexpected. They don't have a bird's eye view as a rule, but the ignorance and the fear of what's where we can't see and what we don't understand, that's great for dramatic purposes. So anyway, that's one answer to it. But a thing I've done is I've broken down the parts of a campaign and what you're likely to be able to talk about in it. The training, the marching to battle, which can take weeks. When you get your first impression that the enemy is out there, what happens? When you get in the range of long-range weapons, when you get closer, what's on the mind of the characters? This is a good time to discuss this problem, So, really you're telling a story, and you should construct the story first. Figure out what you want your characters to go through. And then you design the battle or the lack of a battle to fit what you want to do to your character. So you might want to psychologically torture them, but not actually get them hurt. Well, okay. So they never come under fire. Yeah.
So if someone is writing fantasy or sci-fi, then obviously they can make that whatever they want to. If somebody's wanting to write within the context of an actual battle and they want one of those things but don't want the other, do you recommend that they look for a particular battle that fits the needs, or can you always find a circumstance within any particular historical event that suits the needs you need for your character?
You can pretty much make it up in any historical context, because in a battle, there are folks who are doing all sorts of different things that don't seem to be associated with what happens at the front, right?
Yep.
There are people who are waiting in the back to deal with the wounded. There are people who are running supplies up and back. There are people who are controlling prisoners. There are, folks who are just waiting in case they need to be thrown into the line somewhere. And all sorts of little tasks that individuals can be sent on, running messages, for instance. In fiction, it's a useful position to use because they move across the battlefield, so they get to see more things than somebody who's standing in one place. But, it's what I would often do when people were calling me was think up a battle that might be relevant. But on the whole, you can just make up a situation in which this will happen, but that won't. They won't be close to that, so it won't happen.
When I'm going back from a character development point of view to stories like Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, that is sort of an ensemble cast, but forming around a particular central character. So I can imagine that a easy trap to fall into is you have, you're describing the unit, and you get, like a writer could get too excited about this idea that the unit itself is kind of a character unto itself, and now they want to give equal time to all the members of that organization that they're focusing on. And can you talk a little bit about how you can use like the military ranks or the military roles or something like that to make a story more focused than just, now here's this person's story, now here's this person's story?
Yes. Again, you treat the unit as a character and you ask, what is the unit trying to do? Well, who would be actively trying to do something about that in the unit? And it won't be everybody. If we're putting people in position to await an attack, your focus would probably be the sergeants who make platoons get in shape and are going from soldier to soldier, putting them right here. You need to be here. And don't do anything until I tell you. If you want somebody who's frightened and confused, you probably just want the foot soldier. If you want an impression of the thing that isn't trained, a soldier who's had some experience will probably know what to expect. But the kid who's been brought along to bring water to the troops, he would be the guy, you want to get the impressionistic view of what's happening, because he won't understand it. He'll have his job and he'll be concerned and he'll smell the smells and so on, frequently slipping into the mind of really minor characters tends to enrich what's going on. We have that tendency to focus on the key players and only use their points of view. But it could be really interesting and surprising to the reader to bring up somebody they're not expecting, who probably won't be a hero, but who has real concerns too, just to remind you of how terrifying this all can be, for instance.
It makes me think of stories that I would not think of as warfare stories, but I can kind of see the applicability. So I love using the movie Alien as an example. And some of the things you're talking about, it's kind of like the end of Brothers in Space, So I think that could be a circumstance where obviously it's a non-historical genre, but it's also not exactly warfare, but can use some of the concepts you're describing, I think.
Oh, yes. In fact, there's a specific scene in Alien, in the first one, that I teach. It's in one of my chapters. One of the things, and this goes all the way back to Homer. Achilles loses his armor when Patroclus dies. And so we get basically 2 chapters out of the arming of Achilles. His mom goes off to the gods and gets this fancy shield made, and then there's this, and then there's that. And we go through the details of the equipping. And that builds drama, because it reminds us that each individual in a war has to decide what they're going to carry. And that's all they've got. And there's the scene in Alien where she equips herself for battle. And it's a lovely scene as she's strapping things on and she's picking which gun. And, it builds the drama and your empathy because she's getting ready to do it, isn't she?
Yeah.
The famous first couple, particularly the second paragraph of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, famous short story. It's all about the arming of that squad. Who carries what into battle in Vietnam and why? The choices they make and the things that, they all have to have the helmet. They all have to have the bandages, but this one carries extra canned peaches and that one carries extra ammunition and he's got a Bible and So, and there are a couple of other things in Alien that fall into my categories. One of them, the opening sequence, up to the point where they realize it's not our system that they're in. That's the first glimmer sequence as I divide it. They discover that they're out of place. And, it's done indirectly with silly arguing, and you're getting the characters, the folks in that scene are characterizing themselves. There's the woman who keeps explaining and nobody listens to her, and, get a lot of work done very quickly. And yes, this is the first glimmer that something's wrong. Why have we been alerted? Yeah.
Well, it is interesting that the saying about, battle is, what is it, like 1% terror, 99% boredom, or whatever that saying is. Both of those.
That is warfare. Yeah.
Yeah. Both of those circumstances are good for character development. Like, what does a character do when they're bored? But they know that at any moment the terror might set in, and how do they deal with themselves when the terror has set in?
Yep. Yeah.
It also makes me think that if you take a situation like that, where there are these unexpected participants, or the other thing I was thinking of was, I also grown up in Pennsylvania, so, have been to Gettysburg. And if you took one of those, an individual incident, not an entire like World War II or something like that, if you took what was the famous taking of the hill in Gettysburg, and examine that, I think it would be a super fun writing exercise, because these are the things that have grabbed audiences' attention. You hear these stories over and over again. And to write a story that's completely unassociated with warfare, but mimicking what happened. The enemy, whatever that is on its way. There's the one person who you wouldn't expect to be the one who steps up and saves the day, or rallies the troops, or figures out a clever way to get out of the situation. And it would be interesting to say, okay, well, this person who was the lieutenant in the battle scene is going to become my, the manager of my office building, or whatever it is. It would be an interesting exercise.
And I expect it has been done because, the military unit has a problem in front of it, and it could be a product delivery deadline. Your story, that's, it's the same kind of issue. So, yes, I do suggest it as a source for inspiration for non-warfare stories.
Yeah.
Military history has lots of intriguing things in it.
Well, I wanted to loop back to a very specific thing you had mentioned early on, and that was that there are documents that journalists can get a hold of to help them understand more modern warfare circumstances. Are those things that are available to anyone? Are those resources that would be available to writers if they're writing about current events?
Actually, I have not been following them the last few years, but yes, they're available to folks. And, one of the things you can do now is just Google Journalist's Guide to War in Ukraine. And you're likely to find a number of things, because that's the kind of thing that the wire services need. I do have a couple from World War II, the little explanatory guides for, how things are going. The old guides to how to be an officer, this is the infantry manual that was used by both sides in the Civil War. The guy who became the Confederate General Hardee wrote it. And, it says tactics, but in that era, tactics didn't mean how you fight on the battlefield. It meant how you march into place and shoot your gun. Not what you should be trying to achieve with that, just because
like procedures or something.
Formation. So if you're going to get soldiers, in place, these are the commands you give. This is how you have had to train them, how to turn left, how to spread left, how to widen out, how to tighten in, all that. That was what they called tactics. And, and I've got the Royal Navy Officer's Pocket Manual. And what can be fascinating with these things is that they will bring up things that you won't have thought about. As for instance, this thing tells you how to set up a movie. If you're on a battleship, you want to show the guys a movie, well, this is how you do it.
No kidding. That's funny.
Movies are pretty new in World War I, but they were already doing that kind of thing. How people buy toothpaste on the ship. It just reminds you that there's a lot more going on.
Yeah, those are the kind of things, and that kind of harks back to our early conversation in the previous episode about it's the little things, the details that count, and that idea that dropping something in about how the guy in the warship gets his toothpaste is a really fun detail to add.
Exactly. I should talk about one more thing before we get it in, no matter what. The biggest thing in warfare is logistics. And it often doesn't get talked about much, but it defines almost everything. And the truth is that on most of the surface of this planet, we can't have a fight because nobody can get there with enough equipment to do it. Back in Desert Storm, it took months to put an army into the desert and get it set up so that it could do something. Months. And, as soon as they left the start line, they're running out of fuel and food. And, we're lucky the battle only lasted like 72 hours because things would have gotten painful very shortly thereafter. The more modern warfare is, the more difficult the logistics are because it's simple mechanics. We now have machines that can shoot tons of ammunition in a minute. Well, each individual ton of ammunition has to be dragged up to the gun. And it has to have been in a ship or something first. And, well, that means there's a whole train of history behind it. And, in fact, everybody's going to have limited ammunition. They're going to have limited food. They're going to have limited water. And the best generals are the ones who focus primarily on logistics. In every battle, logistics is the thing. And if you feed the troops, if you make sure they have water and that they think there are enough weapons around to protect them, they will love you as a commander. They will, go the extra mile if you take care of them.
Well, if we haven't given people a ton of ideas for storylines for their work, they're just not paying attention.
That's it.
That's so great. Well, Timons, as always, it is lovely to talk to you and find out these bits of wisdom we wouldn't otherwise find out. So please let everyone know where they can find out more about you online if they would like to follow you.
Well, I have a website, www.timonsesaias.com. If you want to be my Facebook friend, I'm there on Blue Sky as well. And if you just Google me, you'll, find some other interviews and stories and podcasts and such like.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Timons. If you've written books that include warfare, what unexpected challenges have you faced when writing or researching those scenes? Hop on over to the Indy Author on YouTube and let us know. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.